STALKER, Shadow of Chernobyl, and Call of Pripyat are two of my favorite games of all time. They are the most immersive games I've ever played in my life, and they still hold up really well to this day after 15 years. I've always wanted to make something like it in GameMaker, but of course, pulling off a large open-world 3D first-person shooter in GameMaker is nothing short of extremely difficult. I love these games because of their immersion, fun and well-paced gameplay, amazing atmosphere, and their great setting. Naturally, the game isn't perfect, but they are both great games nonetheless. Set in a nuclear wasteland that was once the area surrounding the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and the city of Pripyat, you are someone who willingly traveled to this terrible place for a variety of reasons. This year, I decided I wanted to try my hand at making something like Shadow of Chernobyl in GameMaker. Again, this would prove to be very difficult to do, but I would be pretty happy with a little tech demo, with a condensed open world and some cool gameplay features. GameMaker is a fantastic engine. I started using it in 2008 after I found an old book at the library about GameMaker 6. Initially, I developed nothing but 2D games that I also uploaded to Yo-Yo Games, most of which are unfortunately gone by now. After I learned that GameMaker was also capable of making 3D games, I knew for sure that I was going to have a lot of fun with it. Unfortunately, GameMaker's 3D wasn't quite up to snuff back then compared to other engines of the time, such as the Source engine, Unity 3D, CryEngine, and many more. GameMaker was mostly focused on 2D games, but there were some seriously notable 3D games made with it back in the day as well. GameMaker's 3D has seen several upgrades throughout the years. It became more optimized and gained some new features later on, including shaders with Studio One. GameMaker Studio 2, however, completely changes things up by omitting the original Deep 3D functions that were present from GameMaker 6 all the way up to Studio 1. But this doesn't mean that Studio 2 isn't capable of making 3D games as well. Quite the contrary, actually. Studio 2 is the best version of GameMaker to develop 3D games with, if you wish to do so, of course. Not only because it's the most recent version, but also because it has so many cool features that Studio 1 and older simply don't have. So even with that in mind, knowing that making a 3D game in GameMaker is like building a house with a hammer, I still decided to start my FPS project using GameMaker Studio 2. I wanted to get started right away, so I open up GameMaker Studio 2 and do the usual stuff. I create a sprite for my player, draw a blue circle with a red horizontal line as part of the tradition, and that is the first thing I always do when starting a new 3D project in GameMaker. I've been doing that for roughly 12 years, so why stop now? I then create a player object, do the usual 3D initialization stuff, and allow the player to view the world in 3D space. After all that was done, I started doing some modeling using Blender. I created a little playable area using very basic geometry. I also created a few props to help convey the game's setting during later stages of development, and then I exported them as OBJ files. Now, I'm not going to load OBJ files into my game, no, instead I'll be using vertex buffers. Vertex buffers are a lot faster than OBJ files from my experience, and they can also be quote-unquote frozen to help boost the game's performance even more. So I used a handy little GameMaker tool that converts OBJ files to vertex buffer files, which can then be loaded into GameMaker using this simple script. After fiddling a little bit with how I wanted the game to look, I decided to load up the models that I already made and draw them in GameMaker to see what the game looked like at that stage. Clearly, it is not up there as far as graphics are concerned. At this stage, I had never worked with PBR materials before in GameMaker, let alone with normal, bump, and specular maps. I firmly believe that good lighting and normal and specular maps would improve the graphics so much that it would look miles better than what I had put out before. All games I uploaded before used diffuse textures only with fake lighting baked into them. This time, with my better PC, I wanted to try my hand at using real-time lighting with normal and specular maps. Other game engines have been using normal bump and specular maps for decades, so it was time for me to try and implement them in GameMaker. I started following some tutorials here and there, and with my limited shader knowledge, this was no easy feat to pull off. After struggling with tangents, vector math, GLSL in general, and some frustration here and there of course, I finally got it to work somehow. And this is what it looked like. After getting the PBR materials to work, it was time to make everything look a bit more alive. I added some post-processing effects such as a color filter, motion blur, and some blend modes to make the colors look more natural. I also added some more contrast to make it look a bit more like an actual movie. One of the many things the Stalker series gets right every single time is environmental storytelling. So I finally decided to add the props I made in Blender to the game as well. I textured them first using Substance Painter to get the diffuse, normal, and specular textures, and I then created the most basic of room editors that allows me to place props all around the map. These are then written to a file with the press of a button, and then loaded up next time you run the game, so it's very handy. I also wrote a little script that checks whether an object is outside or inside a building. Depending on whether the object is placed outside or not, the behavior of the PBR shader is then altered to fit the current lighting conditions. Outside meaning more light, of course. So we're pretty well underway developing our FPS, but we're missing a key part here. We've got the first person part covered, but we're still missing the shooter part. So I went back into Blender and modeled a simple Soviet-era handgun. I then opened it in Substance Painter again to get the right textures, and then I loaded it up in GameMaker. Simple as that. I decided to draw the player's weapons to another surface because I wanted to use a blur shader on the guns. I also started working a bit on the outdoors environment by adding playground props, fences, and some 3D grass that sways in the wind using the same shader. For the grass I also wrote a hue shader to create some color variation instead of having one uniform green block of grass. I then wanted to implement a day and night cycle, which still requires a bit of work to get right. The fog doesn't adapt as well as I'd like, and it becomes impossible to see at night, but it's definitely nice to have. Now we still need to implement shooting, but I wanted to combine that with sound design. Stalker sound design is good, but definitely not perfect. For example, gun sounds are the same for both indoors and outdoors. I also wanted different gun sounds for each weapon, one for indoors and one for outdoors. So I layered a few gunshot sounds together and added loads of reverb in Audacity for the indoor ones. And for the outdoor ones I didn't add any reverb at all, but instead added a longer tail to make it sound like there's loads of echoes happening. While we're on the topic of sound design, Stalker also has music, ambient sounds such as wind, birds, distant gunshots, and creepy noises playing every now and then, which really brings the whole experience together. I wanted to have something similar too, so I added wind sounds, crows, and the sound of rustling leaves to give the player the best post-apocalyptic experience there is. Also, I made this little wine bottle model for target practice, as advanced AI just wasn't going to happen anytime soon. This is just to test bullet physics and shooting in general. It's a lot of fun developing a game like this, but truth be told, It would have been so much easier to create a Stalker game in Unity or Unreal or even the X-Ray engine that the original Stalker games run on. Easier is not always more fun though, in my opinion. Creating all this stuff was a blast, and sharing little snippets with the community was always really cool as well. This is as far as I'm gonna go for now. I'm going to bed and I might make this a little mini-series. Let me know if you have any questions regarding the development of the game, and I'll try to help you as best as I can. So thank you very much for watching, and stay tuned for more.